Hi, so I'm going to record hopefully an abbreviated version of a tutorial where I run through the basics of rigid body physics, parenting, and a very brief introduction, the very briefest of introductions to basic rigging techniques. Okay, so I will post a link to the presentation that I'm following in the comments. This is the kind of final that we're working towards. So a ball will fall, kind of engage a plank, and it will throw this ball. And this ball actually is our bouncing ball from our previous tutorial. So let's set that scene up. Okay, so this is what the bouncing ball scene looks like. This is what we'll be working to set up. So we want to create a plank. On the one side of the plank is the bouncing ball. The low side of the plank is the bouncing ball from our graph editor tutorial. The plank kind of sits on this cantilever, and then on above the other side of the plank we'll create a new sphere, and that is the sphere that we're going to apply rigid body physics to, that will fall, hit the plank, and then throw our sphere with the animation keyframes on it kind of across and over the scene. So go ahead and create this. It's a cylinder, a plank, and a plane for the floor. Okay, so you want to make sure when you're creating this scene that none of your objects are intersecting, right? So the physics doesn't work properly if we have our planes intersecting. So make sure that you kind of place your board just slightly above the cylinder. Okay, so this is the basic scene setup. The first thing that we're going to want to do is you can apply materials to your scene a little bit later, but let me just run through my presentation. So we've got the plane under the plank. We're going to offset our keyframes. So there's going to be some animation frames where the rigid body sphere, the one that doesn't have the animations associated with it, falls from the sky. That's going to take a little bit of time. We're going to go in and do some micro adjustments later, but for now we want to kind of offset the animation. So I'm going to hold down Shift, left button, click and drag to select all the keyframes in the time slider, and then these two little yellow arrows are going to appear, which allows me to drag my keyframes. And I'm gonna it looks like there's a keyframe on my plane I'm seeing now, so I'm gonna go in and delete that. So now select the bouncing ball sphere, hold down Shift, drag to select all of the keyframes. And I'm going to increase the number of keyframes here to 120, and then drag so that my first keyframe is on frame 20. All right. Next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to create a parent relationship. So I want to parent now this bouncing ball. So I'm going to slide over to frame. I'm actually not going to start on frame 1, because in this example I actually have the bouncing ball starting high. So I'm going to slide over to frame 20 where it should, or 30 I guess, where the bouncing ball has kind of like is at the low point of the bounce where I've kind of set my scene up. And then I'm going to parent. So under my animation drop down, go to constrain and then parent. And then I'm going to want to maintain my offset and then click apply. So select my bouncing ball, find that second bounce, which is now frame 29, and just double check, make sure, yeah, it looks good. So when you're parenting, parenting is going to allow you to kind of create like followers. So the board is going to be the parent, it's going to control the sphere. So you always want to select the parent first, then hold down shift and then select the child. What that does, I'll show you in a second, is going to mean that whenever I move my plank, my child will move with the plank, but I can still independently move the child independent from the plank. So I want to make sure I maintain offset. That's going to keep this sphere in the relative position relative to the plank that it is now when I parent. And then this weight we're going to adjust later, but for now we want the weight at 1, and we want translate and rotate all, and animation none, and set later to override we want to check. So defaults for that, and select apply. So now when I move my plank, my sphere moves with my plank, but I can still select the sphere and move it independently from the plank. So that's the kind of basic of the parent-child relationship. This becomes really important when we get into rigging, which we'll get into next. And I might show a little bit at the end of the discussion today. All right, so now my board, my sphere is a child of my board. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is add some passive body, rigid body, passive bodies. So what that means is that, so the next thing that we want to do is select the cylinder and the floor, the plane, and create passive rigid bodies. So that is under our effects tab, and then fields and solvers, and then create passive rigid body. I'm going to show you the kind of the settings for that, but we actually won't need, so select the floor and select the cylinder, and then under my effects tab, and then fields and solvers, and then create passive rigid body. So you can set the mass of the object, right? So like if this was a feather, it would interact very differently than if it was lead, right, with gravity. These are static friction, so like if other active rigid bodies are engaging with these passive bodies, are they sliding across it like ice, or is it kind of rough like sandpaper, and does it create friction and drag? So that's what these properties have to do with. I'm going to just, for now, use all of the defaults, but just know that that's an option for you. So I'm going to say apply. And what passive rigid bodies do is they're kind of like big unmoving objects, where other objects that are active rigid bodies in the scene will interact with them, bounce off them, but these will not move. They won't be calculated they won't bounce. So like if something hits them, they stay where they are. Gravity doesn't apply to them. So these would be things that like are unmoving. Like if you were creating like an architectural scene and you wanted, physics to engage, you'd probably want the house to be a passive rigid body, right? So things could bounce off the walls, but the house itself isn't going to deform, move, or kind of interact with the objects. So that's kind of what I've created here. All right, so I want to create active rigid bodies though for the falling sphere and the plank. So let's get my present here. So for the sphere and the plank, I'm going to select both and then go into the same thing, FX tab, fields and solvers, and then create active rigid body. I'm going to get the same settings. I'll just show you. So sphere, plank, and under fields and solvers, create active rigid body. Same thing, mass, frictions, bounciness, how like rubbery is it, for example. And I'm going to hit apply. So now when I press play, nothing's going to happen, and that is because I haven't added gravity to my scene yet. So I need to add gravity to my scene. So I'm going to press stop, and then I'm going to scroll back and present here. So now I need to go into fields and solvers and click gravity. So I'll show you that and the settings there. So under, I think I can make this full screen. Fields and solvers. That's why I don't do that. and I'm going to create gravity. So under the gravity options, the magnitude 9.8 is gravity as it would function on Earth, but you can change that. For instance, if your scene is on the moon, gravity won't be as strong, right? And you can change the direction, right? Like, are we in an upside down world where gravity moves up, or does gravity move to the side? So you can change those features there. I'm just going to use the defaults and hit apply. All right, so now I can see that I have a gravity field in my scene. Gravity kind of applies to all objects that have a rigid body, active rigid body component to them. So I'm going to press play, and bloop. And you can see the bouncing sphere that I have animation keyframes on doesn't have a rigid body physics associated with it. So the physics here is like a little bit off, right? The plank is kind of like using its own weight to before the other ball even hits it to kind of move. If this sphere had a passive body or an active body rigid physics, it would be calculated into the gravity, and it would weight the plank down. So that's what we're seeing. All right, so that is the basics of the kind of applying the physics to this.